Venezuela, once a shining beacon of prosperity in South America, now stands as a cautionary tale of economic mismanagement, corruption, and political instability. From its oil food boom in the 20th century to the economic and humanitarian crisis that has gripped the nation in recent years, the story of Venezuela is a tragic descent into chaos. This video of the No Brainer podcast, we will explore how a country with the world's largest proven oil reserves collapsed into economic ruins, and how the recent rigged election of 2024 further plunged the nation into uncertainty. Venezuela's economy was once regarded as, at its peak, the success of Latin America. In the mid-20th century, the discovery of vast oil reserves transformed the nation into one of the wealthiest regions. By the 1950s, Venezuela was producing over 2.3 million barrels of oil per day, attracting the foreign investment from all over the world and bringing immense wealth to the country. This period, often referred to as the golden era of Venezuela, saw significant infrastructure development, a booming middle class, and a relatively stable political environment. Oil revenues funded ambitious social programs, education, and healthcare, improving the quality of life for many Venezuelans. The country became known for its modern cities, advanced infrastructure, and a flourishing, booming cultural scene. Venezuela was also a hub for international diplomacy, playing a key role in the formation of OPEC in 1960. But beneath this prosperity, there were signs of trouble already. The oil brought wealth, it also created deep economic dependencies and vulnerabilities. The successive governments became overly reliant on oil revenues, neglecting other sectors of the economy completely, particularly agriculture and manufacturing. The wealth gap widened, and a corruption began to take root as these political leaders sought to control the oil industry. In the 1970s, under President Carlos Andrés Pérez, the government nationalized the oil industry, which consolidated control, but also grew the seed of inefficiency and mismanagement in the oil industry and the political environment of Venezuela. So then, in the 1980s and 90s, there came a series of economic shocks that revealed the fragility of Venezuela's oil-dependent economy. A global oil glut in the 1980s caused price to plummet, which drastically reduces the government's revenues. The Paris administration attempted at economic reform, including austerity measures and IMF-backed structural adjustments, which, met with public backlashes, culminated the Caracazo riots of 1989. The governments responded with brutal force, killing hundreds and deepening public distrust in the political system. By then, the Venezuela government and the oil industry were already at risk, and they were showing clear signs of mismanagement and concerning troubles in the future. Aftermath of the Caracazo event, Venezuela was in need for political change. Then entered Hugo Chavez, a somewhat charismatic former military officer who, in 1992, attempted a coup against the Paris government. Although the coup failed, Chavez became a symbol of resistance against the corrupt government. His subsequent imprisonment only elevated his status, and once his release, he capitalized on the widespread discontent to launch a successful presidential campaign in 1998. Chavez's election marked the beginning of a new era in Venezuelan politics, one that would profoundly shape the country's future. Chavez implemented sweeping social programs funded by high oil prices, which matched the global boom in oil demand. His government launched initiatives like Mission Robinson, which sought to eradicate illiteracy, and Mission Barrio Adentro, which provided healthcare to the poor, and poverty with inequality initially decreased, which earned Chavez a widespread support among the working class and marginalized communities. However, administration also engaged in widespread nationalization, which expropriates private property and centralizes power in the executive branch. With this, Chavez's focus on consolidating power and dismantling opposition further polarized the country. He wrote the constitution extending the presidential terms and increased his executive powers. Chavez also purged the judiciary, military, and state oil company PDVSA of dissenting voices. While these policies initially gained popular support, they also led to the economic distortion, inefficiencies, and further corruption, which laid the foundation for future economic crises. While Chavez's image seemed pleasant to the public, his policies, which initially gained popular support, were the ones that led to a further foundation for economic distortion, inefficiencies, and the real economic crisis. Following Chavez's death in 2013, his successor, Nicolas Maduro, inherited an economy on brink of collapse. Years of mismanagement, corruption, and heavy-handed economic policies, such as currency controls and the nationalization of industries, had already eroded Venezuela's productive capacity. The country's over-reliance on oil revenues, combined with plummeting oil prices in 2014, pushed Venezuela into a deep recession. By 2016, Venezuela's oil production had fallen to its lowest level in decades. As the crisis began to show its face, hyperinflation soared, which reached over 1 million by 2018 and made the Venezuelan currency almost worthless. Basic goods like food and medicine became scarce, leading to widespread malnutrition and the collapse of the healthcare system. The situation became so dire that millions of Venezuelans fled the country, creating one of the largest refugee crises in the world. The government's attempt to control the crisis, such as price controls, increased state intervention, and printing more money, only made things worse. The humanitarian impact of the economy collapse was catastrophic. Millions and millions flooded into places around the world, such as America. Hospitals lacked basic supplies, leading to preventable deaths. Long lines for food and essentials became a daily reality for Venezuelans, and the black market of Venezuela thrived as people sought to obtain goods at any cost, further fueling corruption and crime. Public discontent boiled over into massive protests, which met with violent crackdown by security forces loyal to Maduro. Venezuela's economic collapse was accompanied by growing political turmoil. Maduro's government increasingly relied on authoritarian measures such as oppressing the public and dissolving the opposition's controlled National Assembly in 2017, and creating a parallel constituent assembly which was only loyal to his regime. This move was widely condemned both domestically and internationally, leading to a political standoff that further destabilized the country. The international community responded with a mix of sanctions, diplomatic pressures, and humanitarian aid. The US, the EU, and several Latin American countries imposed sanctions on Maduro's government, which targeted key officials and the state oil company PDVSA. These sanctions, intended to weaken Maduro's hold on power, further crippled Venezuela's economy. Meanwhile, neighboring countries struggled to cope with the influx of Venezuelan refugees, and regional organizations like the Lima Group called for a peaceful resolution to the crisis. Despite the international community's humanitarian aid, the humanitarian situation continued to worsen in Venezuela. Aid organizations faced significant challenges in delivering assistance, where the government blocked foreign aid and accused these organizations of using it as a political tool from other countries. The 2019 standoff was also an example of the government's willingness to sacrifice the well-being of its people to maintain control, where at the Colombian border between Venezuela and Colombia, trucks carrying humanitarian aid for the people of Venezuela were set on fire by the government. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan diaspora grew, with millions of people seeking refuge in Colombia, Brazil, and beyond. In 2024, Venezuela faced yet another critical moment in its history. The presidential election, which was concerned with widespread allegations of fraud, voter suppression, and irregularities, resulted in an outcome that is viewed as illegitimate. The government-controlled National Electoral Council manipulated voter rolls, restricted opposition candidates from running, and used state resources to ensure the president's victory. International election observers were largely barred from monitoring the process. The key opposition figures from other parties were either imprisoned, exiled, or disqualified from even running. The election's aftermath saw renewed protests, with citizens taking to the streets to demand a fair and transparent electoral process. The government responded with a brutal crackdown, using tear gas, rubber bullets, and even live ammunition against the demonstrators. As the political crisis deepened, many feared that Venezuela was descending into a new era of dictatorship. Where does Venezuela go from here? Venezuela's future remains uncertain. The economic collapse has left deep scars in the country, and the country's political landscape is as fractured as ever. The international community faces challenges of balancing pressure on the government with a need to provide aid to those suffering the most. Some analysts suggest that economic recovery could take decades, even with significant political reforms. Others fear that without a negotiated political solution, the country could remain trapped in a cycle of violence and instability forever. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe to the No Brainer podcast and like this video and comment below on your thoughts on Venezuela's situation and more topics we should talk about in the future.